In today's video, we'll be looking at HMS Ajax, an interesting ship in regard to her story. This is a cruiser best known for one thing: the Battle of the River Plate against Graf Spee. That was, however, far from the end of her story. Ajax would serve throughout the rest of the conflict, primarily in the Mediterranean, where she would have one of the more eventful careers when it came to fighting the Regia Marina, even if she was out of the war for more or less 2 years. Let's look at that story in this video, from River Plate to battle damage and refit, and finally to where her story came to an end, starting, of course, when the ship was laid down. That came on February 7th, 1933, in the Vickers Armstrong Yard. Ajax's construction would, from this point, go rather quickly. The ship was launched a little over a year later, on March 1st of 1934, and then commissioned on June 3rd, 1935. For peacetime, this was actually pretty quick. Nonetheless, Ajax still joined service in the middle of the 1930s, only a few years before conflict would return to Europe. As a result, her peacetime career was relatively short. Before that, however, we have the usual design segment. HMS Ajax was a member of the Leander class. These were the first truly modern British light cruisers compared to their predecessors, most of which were Great War holdovers with single-mounted guns. Leander was a large improvement in this regard, displacing 7,400 or so tons at the standard loading, with that going up to around 9,400 at the deep load. Ajax was actually a bit lighter at 6,837 tons on her standard loading. This displacement came with the most notable improvement on this design: a main battery of 8 6-inch 152mm guns in 4 twin turrets. These were carried in super-firing pairs, one on the bow and one on the stern. To support those, Ajax also carried a secondary battery of 4 4-inch dual-purpose guns, carried 2 to a side next to the funnel. These were her most effective anti-aircraft defense, at least as designed, because beyond that, there were only a dozen 50 caliber machine guns in 3 quadruple mountings. On the other hand, the ship did carry a decent torpedo battery, 8 tubes in 2 quadruple mounts, one on either side of the ship just behind the funnel. The cruiser also carried equipment to support a scout plane. As for the armor protection, that varies on the source. You'll see a 4-inch main belt sighted, for example, while Friedman notes it as 3 inches on 1 inch, meaning 3 inches of armor on 1 inch of structural steel, which is admittedly still 4 inches, just in 2 different layers. Either way, the last thing to note is speed. This came out to 32.5 knots on 72,000 shaft horsepower, through 4 shafts. And with that rounding things off here, we can return to service. As stated, this began on June 3rd, 1935, just in time for things to get hot in Africa, with the Italians moving troops to surround Ethiopia. This prompted the British to send Ajax to the Mediterranean instead of her designated station in the West Indies. Italy would, of course, go to war with Ethiopia in October of 1935, no matter what protests the British lodged over it. Ajax would remain in the Mediterranean to keep an eye on things until November, at which point she was detached from that service and sent off to Bermuda for her proper deployment. The cruiser arrived in December and would remain there for the next couple years, although 1936 and 1937 would both be quiet years without much of note, mostly training and exercises along with port visits. However, there was a moment of excitement in June and July of 1937, when Ajax sent men ashore in Trinidad to help quell riots among strikers. Exciting, to be sure, but mostly for the shore party. A bit less exciting in general was a return to Britain at the end of 1937. Ajax returned home for a refit and overhaul, with the most notable change coming to the secondary battery, which swapped to twin 4-inch mounts, a total of 8 barrels compared to the old 4. That refit concluded by January of 1938, with Ajax back in Bermuda by February. She would remain there into 1939 and the outbreak of the Second World War. Because of this, Ajax began the war hunting for German raiders. This would see her catch 2 German ships right after the war kicked off. Specifically on September 3rd, Ajax ran down the freighters Olinda and Karl Fritzen. Both ships were scuttled, although you'll also see sources saying Olinda was sunk by gunfire. After this, Ajax spent the rest of September on patrol duty before joining the hunt for Graf Spee in October 1939. This would prove largely unsuccessful as the Germans evaded the British. In fact, Ajax didn't see any German ships until December, when she joined HMS Cumberland in running down a German liner, the Usukuma, on December 5th. And not long after that, Graf Spee would finally be nailed down. On December 13th, 1939, the German raider was engaged by 3 British cruisers. This would become the Battle of the River Plate, Graf Spee against Ajax, Achilles, and Exeter. In this action, Ajax was hit 7 times. This saw her X and Y turrets, the stern pair, disabled, in addition to some notable structural damage. That said, the cruiser gave as good as she got, shooting up Graf Spee and damaging just about everything that didn't have heavy armor. And Ajax's torpedoes also forced the Germans into a less favorable position. If you're interested in more detail on this action, I have a video on Graf Spee that I'll link in the description. Nonetheless, Ajax came out better than Exeter, which was shot to pieces. The heavy cruiser had to withdraw, leaving the 2 light cruisers to watch the Germans. Fortunately, they would soon be joined by HMS Cumberland, racing up from the Falklands. The 3 cruisers bottled up the German raider. This, coupled with bluffing about a more powerful force, ultimately led to the scuttling of the ship. Graf Spee's raiding career came to an abrupt end, and Ajax could be repaired before returning to patrol duty, at least into the new year. In January 1940, Ajax sailed home for a proper refit. She arrived in Plymouth on January 31st and was taken in hand for the refit, mostly focused on improving anti-aircraft defense and fitting new radar. This ran through June 1940, with the ship rejoining the fleet in July, at which point Ajax was sent off to the Mediterranean, although she would take the long route around Africa, only arriving in Alexandria at the end of September. The ship would then spend the rest of 1940 and much of 1941 in the Mediterranean. Now, most of this service would follow the usual pattern for service in that area. A lot of patrols, a lot of escorting convoys, and a lot of hunting Italian shipping, with one notable exception soon after her arrival. This was a night action on October 12, 1940, the action off Cape Pizarro. This was something that came out of one of those convoy escort runs, specifically a run from Alexandria to Malta, which involved much of the Mediterranean fleet. The Italians didn't intercept it, but they did spot the group. As a counter, they set up a formation of light forces off the coast of Sicily, part of a new plan to engage enemy shipping at night in the Sicilian Narrows. This time it would miss most of the British forces. Ajax, on the other hand, would be caught. She had been steaming on the edge of the 7th Cruiser Division and stumbled into a group of Italian ships, specifically 3 torpedo boats. These would spot Ajax first, around midnight, and close in as the cruiser tried to identify them. 5 torpedoes were launched from 3 different directions. Fortunately, the British captain was prompt in speeding up once he realized the threat. Ajax dodged all the torpedoes, and in a running gunfight, she sank 2 of the torpedo boats. And then, to add further insult to injury, she would also cripple the destroyer Artiglieri, in addition to heavily damaging another one. Artiglieri would be sunk by HMS York after the sun came up. Of course, Ajax did suffer some damage of her own, in addition to losing 13 of her crew, with a further 22 wounded. And then some time in Alexandria for repairs from the battle damage. After this, things were generally quieter for the remainder of 1940. Ajax returned to service in November and continued her old duty, with the only real excitement coming on November 12th when she engaged an Italian convoy. Ajax helped sink 4 merchants, while the Italian escorts would escape the action. One of which, Ram 3, is actually still around today as a museum ship in Croatia, after a winding career that is probably deserving of its own video. As for Ajax, the rest of 1940 would pass without major incident. This would continue into early 1941. Ajax spent her time continuing convoy escorts either to Malta or Crete, and she would also carry troops of her own to Greece on March 4th, 1941. The ship would then be present at the Battle of Cape Matapan from March 28th to March 29th. However, her role there would be relatively minor, at least in comparison to the larger ships. After this, the cruiser continued convoy escorts, which is a bit of a recurring theme at this point, but then again, that's Mediterranean service. A few moments of major excitement mixed in with a lot of escort duty. In fact, the next major event for Ajax came with the evacuation from Crete in May of 1941. This would see the ship hit by bombs on May 21st from German Stukas, and then further near misses on May 29th. This caused some damage and flooding, but nothing the crew couldn't handle. As a result, Ajax was able to support operations off French Syria in June and July. However, by this point, the ship was pretty worn out. Ajax was in need of a major overhaul after basically a year in near constant action. The ship would do some shore bombardment in November and some more escort in December before the new year arrived. In February 1942, she was sent home, arriving in May after sailing the long way around Africa for a second time. The ship then entered into a long refit. More radar was fitted, along with increased anti-aircraft defenses, as well as the removal of her aircraft facilities, in addition to general upkeep after a long time at sea, with this refit concluding by October of 1942, and she didn't return to the Mediterranean until December, only to be hit by a 1,000-pound bomb on January 1st of 1943. This put 2 boiler rooms out of action and damaged a third. Understandably, this required lengthy repairs. Ajax was sent off to the United States, arriving in April of 1943, where she received further improved radar and anti-aircraft defenses, in a refit that ran from May through September. Ultimately, Ajax only returned to service in January 1944, after sailing home and finishing work in Britain, meaning she missed basically all of the midpoint of the war, for better or worse. 1944 wouldn't be much more exciting either. Ajax would spend April and May in the Mediterranean on support missions before shifting to support the Normandy landings in June 1944. This would see her off Gold Beach, shelling German land positions, including dueling with a shore battery that she ultimately disabled. The ship then left the Normandy coast on June 22nd for another refit, to replace her worn-out guns, having fired just under 2,600 shells. Instead of returning to Normandy when this was done, Ajax would be sent back to the Mediterranean to support Operation Dragoon, the landings in southern France. This would occupy the ship until the end of August, at which point she transferred to cover the liberation of the Aegean Islands in September, in addition to other actions around Greece, rounding out 1944 in that general area, before spending 1945 on quieter duty. Ajax was never sent to the Pacific and ended off the war in the Mediterranean. Her post-war service would prove to be short-lived as well. She helped carry the crew of Graf Spee back to Germany, somewhat ironic considering her role in ending that ship. And after this, she would return to the Mediterranean, for admittedly less glamorous duty off the coast of what was then British Palestine, involving interceptions of illegal Jewish immigration, which is far too heavy a topic for this video. Instead, we'll round things off here. Ajax would be decommissioned in February 1948. Attempted sales to foreign navies went nowhere, with the cruiser ultimately being scrapped in late 1949, after pulling a warspite and running aground on November 9th as one last act of defiance. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.